So this is how we cut the fret slots using the power saw. I'm not doing this to show off, I'm just showing you that this is how we do it. Okay, when you sell your first guitar, you can save up, buy the tools and do this. First thing we need to do is to mark a centre line. So this is a new technique you haven't seen before. This is how I find a centre. I roughly guess it, and I put a nice big round number like 10 in the middle. Then what I do is I look at the edges, and you can see this says 7, this says 5. I'm not really looking at the numbers, I'm just looking at the distance. This is a really quick way to find a centre. You can make sure both edges are exactly the same distance away and then mark the centre. We'll do the same this end and then join them up to make a centre line. So I'm drawing the centre line on the side that I want to be the front. I've chosen this side as the front. There's a little bit of a defect down here, but that will be taken out with the radius. Now I'm going to fix it to this pattern using double-sided tape. We use about 4 or 5 pieces. What I like to do is to stick it on, cut it with a blade, and then I use the blade to pick up the corners, like this. So I don't peel the tape off until I'm ready to go. With this, dust is your enemy, so any dust on there will prevent it from sticking. We need it to stick really well so it doesn't move while we're working. Okay, so I'm now ready to go. I'm going to peel the tape off all at once. And stick it down on the pattern. In line with the centre line and about 1/2 inch past the first cut. Line up the centre line at one end. And then line up the centre line at the other end and drop it down. So then you know it's lined up at both ends. Okay, a bit of clamping pressure to activate the double-sided tape, and that's ready to go over to the power fret slotter. So this is my power fret slot saw. It's just a plain old piece of board mounted onto some draw runners, which is mounted onto the cheapest table saw money can buy. The expensive bit was the saw. The actual blade itself is a special order. It has to cut exactly the right width. Mounted on the rail here is a little pin. On the fret scale pattern, there's a notch cut for every fret. So simply insert the notch and run it through the saw. What I like to do is just run it through once, because if I bring it back through, it widens out the slot, which is no good. So this is ready to go. You have to be a little bit careful how you take this off, because of the fret slots it can be quite fragile. So the next thing to do, I'm going to stick it onto this neck template. This is the neck profile. I'd like to show you where this came from. came from the drawing, if we measure here, measure this distance and then measure here, we can mark that out onto a piece of board. This is the kind of thing you're using. If you buy a quarter of a sheet of MDF, you'll get all your patterns out of that. And what we do is, because this is as it came, it was bought, these edges are really nice and straight. So if you just pick in the middle somewhere, measure out your fretboard, measure this distance, you can draw on the taper. Notice this is a lot longer than a neck, so I've used the middle section. That's a great advantage because if I want to make my neck a little bit narrower or a little bit fatter, I can just move it along the neck template. Okay, so I'm going to show you what we do with it. There's also a centerline drawn on this template, although it's quite faint. I might just draw it on again so you can see it. We've got a centerline on the template, and by placing it on the drawing I can see where it matches to mark where the nut is. Okay, so the next thing is to stick the fretboard on in line with the nut there, like this, and in line with the centerline. So I'll just do that now. We use the same double-sided tape. This is actually called exhibition tape. It was invented for exhibitions where they had to rip up the carpets and it was wrecking the tiles, so they invented this tape. It's better than ordinary double-sided tape, it comes off a lot easier. Again, we'll peel up the corners, and then when I'm ready to go, peel them off. And now I'm going to line it up very carefully. This is the nut takeoff point, level with this line and level with the centre line. So we got one end down first and then drop the other end down, and then we know both ends are lined up exactly with the centre line. Okay, so the idea here is that we're going to trim off this excess. We're copying this shape into the fretboard. That is too much for the router to take off. So what we do is we first cut on the bandsaw, cut it reasonably close, and then we'll finish it by profiling with the router. So I'll show you that just now. To the bandsaw. So this is the bandsaw. Basically a metal blade goes round in a circle with teeth on it pointing forward. The critical thing about a bandsaw for us is the depth of cut, because we're gonna need to cut the headstock on here and the neck. The neck is the widest thing that needs to be cut. It's about 4 inches, so you need a bandsaw with at least 4 inches depth of cut, or the width of your headstock. Okay, we're going to trim this fretboard down to size. Whenever we're cutting anything out, it's a 2-stage process. We cut first with the bandsaw and then we profile with the router. So when you're intending to profile with the router, we don't have to cut it even very neatly. We're just going to leave about 1.5 to 2 mil, cut all the way down both sides, and then we'll finish it with the profiler. So when you are using a bandsaw, there's a couple of things that I always tell people. You'll notice when I cut, my hands were well away from the blade. I see people do this. Don't play chicken with the bandsaw because you might just slip. You don't need to put your hands anywhere in line of the blade. My hands are always off to one side like this. You don't need to put your hands anywhere near the blade. We're all guitar players. If anybody loses a finger in here, that's the end of it. I'll call it quits. So I don't want you to be the one that does it. Okay, this is profiling with the router, After it's been cut roughly on the bandsaw, then we're going to use a router and one of these special profiler cutters. So what happens is, if I just demonstrate, the bearing here will follow the pattern and the cutter will copy the shape into the fretboard. It's really simple. This is an especially good cutter. There's actually a turnable blade. So effectively we've got 4 brand new cutters there. The length of the cutter isn't vitally important. Any of these would do. This is my favourite. I'm going to use that one. So we'll put it into the router. We'll clamp the fretboard. And we'll set the depth on the router so that it just cuts nicely through the fretboard but doesn't touch the bench. You don't want the bearing to be touching the bench. So this is profiling. There's 3 things I want to tell you about profiling. It's one of the most dangerous types of routing because the cutter is actually exposed. You could, if you were an idiot, put your hands in there and cut your fingers off. So there's 3 things I need to tell you to protect yourself. 1, we never start the router if the cutter's touching the wood because it might take a chunk out. What we do is we turn it on, away in a safe area, and then we ease in and then we can continue our cut. Second thing, we always go against the direction the cutter's spinning. The cutter spins this way round. You'll soon know if you go the wrong way because it tries to act like a wheel and it tries to accelerate. You're not in full control. If you go the other way, then you're pushing against it all the time. It's much easier to control the speed. Okay, so the third thing, when you finish your cut, you come to the end and you switch off, ease out and wait until the cutter stops spinning before you do this or this, because the router will walk along the bench. And the classic one is everybody does this and it takes a chunk out of your fretboard. Okay, so there's 3 things to avoid. We never start the router if the cutter's touching. We go against the direction the cutter's spinning, and when we've finished we stop and wait until the cutter stops spinning before we do anything. There's just one more thing to protect your fretboard, and that is when you're working, don't tip the router. We keep the router nice and straight. Okay, so I'm just going to profile this fretboard right now. So now we've got a fretboard which is exactly the same shape as the pattern. Be careful how you take it off. We're going to now take that over to the radius machine and put the radius on the front of the fretboard. So this is my fretboard radius machine, used to put the curve on the front of the fretboard. It's simply a sanding machine with a swinging arm. This distance is 12 inches. Puts a 12-inch radius on the front of the fretboard. Okay, it is adjustable, so you could move this up and down, get any radius you want. We can even put a different radius on this end for a compound radius. I've set this up just for a straightforward 12-inch radius, which is the most popular. So here we go. it down. So radiusing the fretboard on the machine takes a lot of the hard work out of it, which reduces a lot of the mistakes I find. If you haven't got a radiused fretboard, if yours is still square, that's fine, but now we're going to cut the ends off. Make sure you cut it in the right place. This is 0 where the nut is, so we're going to cut there. This is the 1st fret. This is the 22nd fret, so the end of the fretboard is here. I'm just going to cut the ends off now. You need to clamp it and then cut with the fret saw. This is why we have a protective cover on the bench, because you're going to cut into your bench. Notice I use 2 hands on the saw. I never do this because you're likely to widen the slot. 2 hands on the saw like this. So that's the fretboard finished. We'll try it on the drawing, see how it looks. Perfect.